Great to meet everyone. I'm Jason. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Test Party. Um, Today we're going to be talking about mobile accessibility, which I think is a very underserved niche of accessibility, and with tons of users. But uh, putting aside accessibility, I know that there's already fewer like native mobile developers and cross-platform mobile developers. So I think it's just a space where not everyone kind of knows what's happening, and specifically in accessibility, there are quite a few unique challenges. I like to start with an analogy. I'm a big classics nerd. I realized that actually, I think the new Odyssey preview trailer just came out. I haven't seen it yet, but this was made. This was made a couple months ago. So I think of mobile accessibility kind of like the Odyssey is compared to the Iliad, where the Iliad in this case is web accessibility. It's a kind of much more well-told story. People know the heroes much better. I think the Odyssey is an equally crazy crucible, and with a lot of interesting characters along the way. So yeah, I think of the Iliad as the web accessibility journey where you have tons of tools, you have tons of people talking about it. Even the AI discourse around accessibility is primarily web focused, I would say. Um, in Odysseus's journey from returning from the Trojan War, for people who don't know the story super well, he encounters a bunch of different mythological creatures, and has to overcome these difficulties in order to return to his home. One of them is the Lotus Eaters, which is basically these group of people on an island who offer up lotus seeds to his sailors and his crew, and happily they're kind of like I think they were very either starving or they were just looking for the happiness that eating these seeds would provide, and instead they like stayed on that island for way too long. And so I think that I jokingly put, the Apple and Android logo in there because these platforms make a lot of promises, right? In terms of their mantra is kind of a lock-in first kind of system versus the web's open nature and kind of the standards that were developed around it. It's a little similar to the Lotus Eaters. And Polyphemus, which was one of the giants that kind of troubled Odysseus. He was in a very dark cave and had to try to navigate while this giant was swinging his club at him. And I think that developers in general just feel a bit lost, like Odysseus was in that cave. And a lot of factors contribute to this, specifically for mobile. And we're going to go into some of the slightly more technical parts of that. Um, and then finally, we come to Ithaca. Hopefully, today we're trying to present not just me venting about the problems of mobile accessibility, but hopefully offer a path forward so that we can achieve the promised land here. A little bit about who I am. I studied economics and then computer science and Latin, hence the mythology and classics nerd. I was an engineer at Twitch on their iOS team, helped them kind of fix a lot of their code on the mobile side when they got sued for accessibility. So a lot of firsthand experience on this topic specifically. And then now I'm the founder and CTO at Test Party, where we're trying to use AI and non-AI techniques to build better automation around accessibility testing and remediation. So a little bit of the contents here. We're going to skip through some of the slides that are very company specific. Today, we're going to keep it pretty theoretical. But first, we're going to talk about the present. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of our solution and then how it addresses a lot of the advice. I think we'll probably just pause after we go through the solution and take questions from there, since I think today's only a 10-minute segment. So the present, what I want to talk about are really first, I like to use a survey just to kind of get people primed on the mobile accessibility statistics. Does anyone know this by off the top of their head of what % of iOS users use larger text? I wish, but it's not that high. The actual answer is around 20%. So I think it's much higher than I would say most accessibility statistics that you've, memorized for any sort of CPAC exam. It's much lower than the general population, but it certainly is a statistic that is worth paying attention to. I think 1 in 5 is humongous already. And typically, when I look over the shoulder of someone on the subway, I can usually find someone with enlarged text. So this was what I could find online. It might have inflated these days with, increased screen usage and deterioration of retinas, but 20% is the quoted statistic. There's also a survey published by the American Federation for the Blind, specifically around mobile accessibility. Now, there's no like real trends that I want to point out here. Certain sectors are more conscious of mobile accessibility than others. This survey did a great job of kind of looking at very diverse application groups, from crypto to banking to ordering. And so, but all in all, you can see that the accessibility is still quite a large barrier. Whether here occasional is defined as less than half the time, whereas frequent is defined as more than half the time. So for the majority of apps, you're still seeing around like 60 to 80+% of encountering issue, like if you add up the occasional and frequent. So you're saying 60 to 80+% of apps, having issues on the mobile accessibility front. So I categorized the 4 main issues of mobile accessibility into like the 4 apocalyptic like horsemen. The first one is around standards, right? So a lot of the room might be familiar with WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I cheekily ask, where is MCAG? Mainly because in order to have a really, thriving ecosystem of developers and open source tools, you need to have like a unified standard. I know that the W3C has released a working paper, a working draft on mobile accessibility, which adds a load of different kind of like controls that otherwise wouldn't exist on web. And I think that that's really important. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, I think just this principle of vague rules creating vague solutions. There's a couple companies that I want to call out that are just doing really great work in terms of creating standards, like CVS Health, T-Mobile. I know that a couple like larger companies have like released mobile accessibility like guidelines that are specific to native frameworks, because things like Swift UI, Kotlin, they just simply don't have the same behavior as like adding, ARIA or something to existing HTML or React or whatever. Most of those APIs are like very specific, and if you think about the controls, like whether it's like swipe, long press, double press, like things that just don't exist as very popular UI interactions, that otherwise the web can kind of get away with just simple buttons and inputs. The second thing that makes this really difficult is lack of automation. So next slide, I show you some of the most popular web frameworks right now for automation. Many of you guys have probably used it in end-to-end testing, or if you're, at an AI startup or something, this is the backbone really of AI agents navigating the web right now. And on the next slide, I think I show you what we have for mobile, which is Appium. I don't know if there are any mobile developers in here. This is like the open source equivalent of Puppeteer or Playwright. It attempts to connect to emulators, and you can write end-to-end tests with it. If anyone has used it, it's very difficult to use. It's like it's got 20K stars, but it's an extremely difficult to maintain framework. And I would say that many companies choose to even not have UI tests simply because like this is very, very flaky and very hard to have the right amount of engineers who have expertise to write for this framework. I think the next slide I talk about really that many people are following OpenAI and their announcements of a lot of features, what you haven't seen from OpenAI is any sort of attempt at mobile automation yet. Because and that's just, me reinforcing the thesis of without kind of the right open source automation tools to begin with, it's very difficult to start systematically testing. On OpenAI, right, with Operator, you can basically tell it to try to book an Airbnb, and what it's doing is it's using Puppeteer and Playwright and screenshotting things and navigating, and you simply just can't achieve that on mobile yet unless you're very, very crafty and trying to over engineer a lot of things. And then the third point that I'll jump to is what I'll label as opaque element structure. So a lot of people, I'll shout out, AxeCore from DQ really is one of the best open source frameworks out there that primarily relies on embedding itself within the HTML DOM. And there is no such DOM in in mobile. If you've tried like maybe cross-platform mobile like React Native, you might have seen like the React Native like debugging tree. It is technically available for you to try to crawl, but that is nowhere near the accessibility provided by the HTML DOM. If you go to the next slide, DOMs are really crucial, I think, to constructing the like the relationship between elements on a screen. Without this sort of representation, you pretty much have to rely on simple visual analysis, and computer vision is not quite there yet in terms of like reconstructing entire views from just a picture and reassociating that with code. The code fundamentally beneath it is where the information lies. And so, yeah, I'm just showing for the people who I know. I met a couple of people who are not engineers. For DOM, it's like the document object model. It just shows kind of the structure of how a page is overlaid. You can see, this element has padding, this one has margins. For mobile, I screenshotted, I think, Xcode, where you basically have a view hierarchy, right? And it's totally useful in terms of debugging things that are just, you're functionally looking for things that are not showing up. But it is very not useful for an automated test, looking for, is something, what is it labeled as, or, the accessibility attributes of something. You just simply, Apple hides a lot of that and you don't have access to it. And that segues perfectly into kind of the platform limitations of, if we go to the next slide, we've noticed that Apple and Google have a certain level of restriction on their APIs for what you can and can't do. And so they have a lot of pre-built components. They only have really a couple fields available for accessibility. Some of them are very, very useful. Some of them are, I think, way too restrictive. And that also makes it really hard to navigate, like how to make things accessible. Oh, okay. That was way faster. So I'll do a summary version of our solution, since I don't want to get too company specific. We've now built on top of like a better automation framework that really kind of strips away the ugly parts of Appium to basically create a new standard that is much closer to Puppeteer, where you can kind of write a YAML-based test file and navigate through screens and create hierarchies around them. So we have what's buried deep within inside Apple and Android are actually, you can capture the element types and the various relationships inside of a hierarchy. And what we've done is now we've created a way to use that hierarchy for real automated testing. And so that's really where this is going, is like, how do you control the mobile emulator, run tests on each individual screen, and still allow like the simulation of like a user journey? So some of the screenshots that we have are from an extension that we're building, and it wraps around a lot of the core like UI inputs that a lot of other, automation can do. But what we do that's very different is that we can do it while detached from, the Apple ecosystem or the Google ecosystem. Like this is strictly within VS Code. So we're basically taking full control of the running of a device, and you're able to test things remotely. You don't need to kind of blend it into an existing end-to-end test, which I alluded to is very hard to maintain on mobile in general. You can kind of out of the box simply create like user journeys and then do accessibility tests on them. And they're catered towards mobile in the way that they're very element specific right now, rather than I think a lot of like WCAG or Axe Core even is very attribute specific, where in mobile right now there aren't that many like ARIA attributes to really validate against. There's not, you're not looking at various like ARIA check states, ARIA live states, all of that. You can only really look at a level of sophistication above that, which is like input elements, date pickers at the functional level. So we like kind of group that into actually through a lot of the hard work of CVS Health as well. They kind of defined a lot of the standards using the various components that are native to each platform. So I'll pause it there. We want to just make it so that it's very automated and it brings like true developer joy to accessibility. I think that that's primarily one of the biggest barriers, I think, is that in order for mass adoption from developers, a dev tool needs to be extremely easy to use and extremely fast to automate. So happy to take any questions there.
Yeah, we're gonna break into two segments here. So Jason's gonna take questions now, a little bit different than we usually do, and then Michael's gonna give his talk, and then we'll do questions for Michael. So any questions in the room for Jason real quick? And I'll look and see if we got anything on. Oh, yes.
Going back to the 20%, does that also include users that blow up their phone using their hands? Because some people may not know about the larger text feature.
I don't think it's including that specific.
Yeah.
I think it's specifically just, and this is just iOS. Like I wasn't even counting like other phones, other platforms.
Yeah, because that stat is from the Apt Foundation's SDK, right?
Yeah, that's right.
242 SDK. Yeah, so that one is measuring specifically having the enlarged font setting enabled at the OS level. Yep.
With the rise of things like PHP and React Native, how easily does this tool integrate into those frameworks?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I do think that cross-platform is like a very popular feature. This new tool, like we didn't build the mobile automation framework. It's a tool called Maestro, but it's very cross-platform, not just with React Native, but also Flutter, Maui. I wouldn't recommend building Maui apps these days, but yes, it's quite compatible there too.
Great talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering, like, how do you balance automation with human feedback in terms of accessibility pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, I think for web, I mean, most people are quoting, low 30%, 25% for what automation is covering right now. DQQ covers, I think, 50% is their stat. Mobile is very far, like mobile, we're in the very early stages. I think there's zero doubt that there's a lot of human input here. I think just the mobile QA process in general is still very human driven, especially when you're dealing with like tapping, the various controls, right, that I talked about. It's still quite hard to consistently simulate that. You've had startups that are trying to like do like robot based like tapping on phones and stuff, and that still hasn't really become consistent and taking off yet. So yeah, I think it will stay at around like a 80% manual, 20% like automation in mobile for a while. I think web could take off beyond that much sooner.
Why do you think web progressed so much? Like, is there a reason?
I think it's the maturity of the tools, the maturity of and the openness of the framework, right? So I think like the HTML framework, the like all of the tools out there are basically open source. You like Apple is actually, I think they just released 2 months ago their like Swift compiler so that you can actually build Swift apps outside of Xcode much easier. But yeah, so we're like maybe a decade behind on the types of tools that have been released for mobile.
One from online. Does pregame integrate with Android Studio?
Like the IDE, like the Android Studio IDE. No, so yeah, I think that's also a very interesting challenge of mobile, and that's part of what I complain about, I guess, is that like with Apple and Google, they've chosen to like lock you into IDEs like Xcode and Android Studio. Even in those like IDEs, you can't like suggest code as easily as like VS Code, which is open source. AI code gen tools are choosing to avoid Xcode and Android Studio specifically for that reason. So I think there's a day that we will try to integrate, but today is not that day.
Any other questions for Jason? Cool. All right. Switch
guys.
gears to Michael.
Yeah, we had Jason go first because his is technical and mine is fun.
Yes. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Now, Jason's was fun too. I think I always enjoy hearing about mobile stuff. Let's go to the next slide after this too. So today we're going to talk about automating the WCAG, if that's possible, what's possible. Jason was all about mobile. I'm talking all about web. And we do see them as two separate, probably parts of the same coin, right? One's the front side, one's the back side. No, there's nothing on the slide. Yeah, that's on purpose. But we're super excited to share a bit more about how we think about web in addition to how we think about mobile, and it is very different and distinct. But obviously, I always like to start with a story. So I'll tell you about me when I was in 5th grade. One of my favorite TV shows was Teen Titans, with like Robin and Raven and Starfire and Beast Boy, and Cyborg. These were like these teenage superheroes who would just like fight like supervillains. And of the 5, I had one that was my favorite, and my favorite was Cyborg. He was this half cybernetic robot, this half man, like chief technology expert that could like shoot blasters out of his hand. That was just crazy to me. I was like, that's so cool. And so I used to love Cyborg. But to me, he was more than just a superhero. He was this black, technology-loving, disabled superhero, right? And in reflecting on making this talk, I realized this is the first and probably one of the only times I've seen a disabled superhero on television, right? And this was a TV show from the 90s, right? And so what does it mean and what was Cyborg? That's kind of the investigation of this talk, right? Before he was Cyborg, he was Victor Stone. He was this athlete, this kind of, strong teenager who his mother eventually passed away in an accident that left him injured. And his father, being this technologist, decided to keep his son alive using cybernetics. The effect of that was that we had Cyborg, this like half technology, half man, assistive device assisted guy who could do more in the world with assistive technologies. So that's kind of the theory of today's talk, right? That Victor Stone plus technology plus his humanness made him this superhero who we called Cyborg, this superhero that I fell in love with when I was like, and still, really love when I was in 6th grade. And I'll argue today, at least one thing that we think about is that AI and the way that you can use AI is to turn yourself into a sort of accessibility superhero, right? That you plus these assistive tools, which are AI tools, plus your own heart will get you into, becoming this sort of superhero. So in the next, let's call it 14 minutes, I'll run through all 3 parts of that. I'll talk about the research behind it and talk about some suggestions on how you can use, AI tools to be a better sort of superhero. But first, about me, who am I? I'm a nerd. This is me. Thank you. Yes, I'll take the applause. This is me and my brother. We were living out our like real life superhero fantasies at Chuck E. Cheese circa 2004 in Seattle, where I grew up. I continued to be nerdy as I got older. I loved computer science. That's what I ended up studying in college. I loved reading, so I studied philosophy. I started donning glasses very early in life. And I now, I didn't actually have to wear glasses growing up. Like, I think I was like farsighted or something, and I just wore them all the time to the point where my eyes are terrible. So now I wear glasses all the time. It's great. I love it. But who am I now? I'm the founder of Test Party and the CEO of Test Party, alongside with Jason. studied computer science and philosophy at Harvard. Before that, I did accessibility consulting at the UN and at Google, and was an investor on behalf of Microsoft into startups. So we were investing in companies like OpenAI, into Kahoot, and that was a fun kind of journey and a fun time. So, and yeah, I'm still a nerd, so that's not going to change. So about this talk, right? Who am I with Test Party? I think of myself almost as Cyborg, and the reason for that is mainly because I really truly believe in what we hope to argue today is that by automating the WCAG, at least what parts of it that you can, specifically remediation, not just finding issues but also fixing them, you can use AI to also become this sort of digital accessibility superhero. So I'll break down all the parts of this thesis statement by talking about, where are we today? What can AI actually do? And what are some practical examples of how AI can help remediate the WCAG? And then we'll talk about the impact and take questions. And then you'll go home and take a good nap and reflect on this talk forever, hopefully. So where are we today? This is chapter 1, episode 1, season 1. Yeah, it's the pilot. This is the pilot. Where are we today? Today, the internet is inaccessible. 95% of the million most visited homepages are inaccessible. I think the stat might now be like 94% as of the most recent. So we've made some progress, which is good. The web is also becoming more complex. So if we look at the number of elements on these homepages, this year has 11.8% more elements, meaning there's more things to test than last year, right? And we anticipate that trend will continue, that the web will get more complex, people will get more creative, they'll want to make more things, and they'll do it with new and difficult and interesting components. Of course, there's this idea of manual auditing, not just for accessibility, but let's think of security, right? Pen testing. Test Party went through SOC 2 compliance. We were told it was going to take us 8 weeks. We finished all of our parts in 8 weeks, and it took another 3 months to get the rest of the audit and to get the rest of the report. And this is common for accessibility, I'm sure, as well, right? As professionals, you have a lot on your plate. You have so many audits, and you only have so many hours in the day and so much energy, right? And so they take months to complete. And the effect of this is there's all these sites, specifically e-commerce websites. We've been diving a lot into e-commerce, working with e-commerce companies, and they're getting sued at super high rates, to the point where in the last 5 years alone, we estimate about $400 million has been paid out in damages and settlements and lawsuits. And this is a whole other talk that we could give about what does it mean for just a select few firms to be doing most of this kind of litigation work, and who's funding that litigation, and why is it being funded in that way. That's not this talk. This one's much more fun. And then, of course, if you look at people in this room and the people on Zoom, I wouldn't be surprised if you admit that you might have burnout, right? And one of the studies that this came from is from Devin Pershing, who in 2023 talks about how about 61% of accessibility professionals experience burnout, right? And so I tried to question, why is this? And if you think about it, we can just go back to Teen Titans, as it all, leads back to. And Cyborg used to argue, when I was an athlete, when I was human, I loved pushing my limits, getting stronger, faster, and better, just by trying harder than I had before. And his coaches would always tell him to give 110%, which he did. I think we're in a very similar position where we're giving our 110%, we're experiencing burnout, but we're only getting out of it 5%. The 5% of the web that's more accessible than it was last year, or maybe now let's call that 6%, right? But are we okay with that? So my argument really is that we could do better than 5%. And one of the ways to do that, if we go to the next 2 slides, is to start using some sort of artificial intelligence, some sort of technology, just like how Victor Stone had his own technology to, in essence, help us out, right? So this leads us to chapter 2, which starts with the poll of the room. How much of the web content accessibility guidelines do we think that AI can automatically remediate? Okay, put your hands up if you think it's 5%. At least 5%. At least 5%. Yeah, okay, cool. Keep your hands up if you think it's at least 20%. AI can fix 20% of bugs, all that alt text and color contrast. Okay, 50%. Half the hands have gone down for people on Zoom. How many people think at least, 75%? Okay, we have 2 dreamers in the room. How many think 100% we can automate all of the web content accessibility guidelines? Okay, hands have gone down. One day, there we go. Both. Yeah. Yeah, so this is a good point. If we go beyond the algos, woohoo, predicting the talk. Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. So let's talk about what AI can do, right? So we are all on the same page. When we think about AI, let's first talk about what it is. AI really is these, at least as we define it today. If we push one more, there's a picture here. I define AI, at least in the context of this talk, as these large language models. Things like ChatGPT, which has O1, O3 Mini, O4, Gemini, right? Google's sorts of tools and technology. And these reasoning models, these large language models, essentially work, as we all probably know, by taking huge amounts of data, adding weights to that data in terms of how they interpret it, and making predictions. And so these predictions are actually getting quite good, right? So if we go to the next slide, we'll be able to see that all of these reasoning models can score better than me on any standardized test, which is kind of a funny realization. Like, why do I need a lawyer when my AI model has an LSAT? It can get 80% of the LSAT, right? Why do I need, a world historian when my AI model gets 100% on the AP World History exam? And so these benchmarks are showing, in effect, that these AI tools are getting better and better and better at what I'll call general logic and general reasoning. I was leading a research study when ChatGPT first came out at the Harvard Business School. The study came out in September of 2023, and I'll walk you through some of the findings because it does kind of delineate what types of learning AI is best at versus worse at. In the experiment, we took 8% of BCG's global workforce, that's the Boston Consulting Group, and we had them do 18 tasks around creativity, analytics, and persuasion. We gave half of the group access to ChatGPT, specifically GPT-4, and half of the group no access. They were just regular humans, Victor Stones, if you will. What we found was that for those who had access to AI with no training, they were able to work about 12.5% faster. They did about 12.5% more work, 25% faster, and had about 40% higher quality. That's what this graphic is showing, the difference between people who didn't use AI versus those who did use AI. If you look at just those who used AI, there's also an interesting barrier that, some people were about 10% better than their other AI using counterparts. So as researchers, we were interested in what was that difference, because the other one is quite obvious. And that difference really showed that there was one set of consultants who called themselves centaurs. I mean, I guess we called them centaurs. They just called themselves people. But there were these mythological kind of half horse, half human creatures that divided the work between themselves and the AI. I'll think about it like this. It's almost as if you were to use a calculator and you'd say, what is 2 + 2? And it would tell you the answer is 4. And you as a human would use 4 to do the rest of your work. That's kind of what I would describe as centaur work. The AI is an assistant to your own thinking. Versus the other half of consultants who performed better were what we call cyborgs, where they completely integrated AI into their workflow, right? And so they're continually interacting with technology. The best example of this that we found in the study, because we had all the chat prompts and how they were talking, was that cyborgs were prompting on average 3.5 times more than a centaur. So a centaur might say, hey, I have to design this new marketing campaign for Nike, which is one of the questions. Give me 10 example names. And, a centaur would just say, these are the names. Whereas a cyborg would actually ask and say, I like name number 5 and 7. Give me more that are like that. Okay, now based off of this, refine it to another subset. And that interaction where you're using AI as almost a sounding board or a teammate, which was the next study that we did, those sorts of performers performed way better than just the ones who would ask AI questions almost as Google search. So the results was that we found, of course, not just within AI, but just generally, that those who used AI did a lot better if they were low performers. So as a low performer, I'm happy about that because it means AI will help me more. But we did find that people who were already skilled did still benefit, right? So people who were not experts had about a 43% increase in perceived output. This is just of the AI users. And of course, for the top half is about a 17% increase. So what does this mean? I want to highlight just how kind of drastic of a change this sort of number is when we say 14% more productivity or 23% faster. Historians estimate that when steam and power entered factories in the 19th century, it improved performance by about 18 to 22%. And so now that we're seeing AI, which is doing mid-double-digit improvements, that's significant, right? And so I just want to highlight that just for context, to put it in not numbers, but in kind of historical relevance. So there's two takeaways from this that I want to share. First is that the expert AI, quite honestly, expert AI is going to be better than the average human, right? And really, expert human is still going to be better than the average AI, right? Which is good for a lot of us, what I call T-shaped people who have a lot of different interests, but one focus area. AI may beat us in all of the other various interests, but that focus area is where we're going to win. And second, how you use AI is much more important than whether you use AI, right? And I bring it back to the cyborg versus centaur. Are you using AI as a frequent sounding board, or as a one and done, as a one-shot tool? And one of these ways, right, the first way, the cyborg way, is much better than the separated centaur way. These are the two kind of major takeaways. And I want to argue that this is the right way to think about trying to automate the WCAG. I think I have 2 minutes left before I open up into Q&A. So with those 2 minutes, I'm going to speed through a couple more of these slides. When you think of what the new experiment is, one of the new experiments is just trying to be more practical, bringing this into our day-to-day life in a corporate setting. So there's a couple examples of how you're probably already using AI tools, whether it's Grammarly, whether it's Be My Eyes, GitHub Copilot. You can now put on Windsurf and Codium. If you don't know any of these startups, just Google them. But this is really the next frontier of what the future, I think, of AI technology is going to look like. As it applies to accessibility, of course, there's Be My Eyes. There's a good quote here. We can share these slides afterwards. But I do think there's a lot of questions about, can you automate the WCAG? And we're talking not just about testing, but remediation. So I know I asked you this question earlier, and I decided to ask AI the same question. I asked AI, how much of the WCAG can be automated, with tools like large language models. So DeepSeek said 70%. So 20% can be fully automated, 50% with human in the loop. Claude said 75%, so it's a bit more ambitious. Yeah, the dreamers. Claude is a dreamer too. 17% fully automated, 30% human in the loop. ChatGPT said 80% automation. Thank you, Sam Altman. 50% fully automated, 30% human in the loop. Gemini said 95% automation. Actually, originally it said 100%, and I said, come on. And it was okay, 95. It said 95. I think it was DeepSeek, 70%. Yeah, the most. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But what can't AI remediate, right? There's a lot to think about here. And again, we're talking about remediation, not testing. I think that's really much more exciting, in my opinion. But what can't AI remediate when it comes to web content accessibility guidelines? I'm lazy, so I asked AI, what can't you do? And it told me this. It said, hey, if you look at subjectivity versus automation feasibility, that's the metric that you can start to weigh to see what we can and can't automate. So things that are like, for instance, super subjective, but very low automation is the hard part. That was a ChatGPT answer. I asked Claude the same question, and it had another matrix of, again, contextuality versus automation potential, which I feel like is not fair. Like if I was like, how automatable is this? And one of the metrics axes was that it's automatable. I don't know. Thanks, Claude. We'll move on to the next one. I asked Gemini, and it said, okay, if it's a basic pattern versus an advanced pattern, and if it's simple and rules-based versus being more contextual and complex. So really, if you kind of summarize this, there's a number of things that these models are predicting that it can and can't remediate. And really, in summary, as I think of it, it's really that the experts in this area are always going to be valuable because the AI can't replace the expertise. That subjective judgment, the how automatable is this metric, really is the intangibles, right? The idea of your heart. It's what you're doing when you're at your best. In the same way that, Victor Stone with his technology still needed to have, ethics and morals, or else he would have been a supervillain, right? We're in the same category here as accessibility superheroes. I know we're getting towards the end of the time, so let's go to one of the examples that we have in here. Keep going. Actually, go back to 3 or 4 slides. Let's talk about human in the loop, and then I'll wrap up there. One thing that I really love to think about is human in the loop. It was a question earlier, like how do you moderate these AI systems to ensure that the outputs are actually accurate? And we argue that the best way to do that is through what's called human in the loop, and that's where the centaur versus the cyborg mentality really is the most different. Like a cyborg is constantly involving themselves in the loop of the AI interaction, right? Like when I'm prompting 8 times in a row, I'm validating and reprompting and revalidating. And so there's something to be said here that having a human in the loop is quite important. And we're pretty familiar with this, I think, anecdotally already, as people, right? Because we use human in the loop technologies all the time, right? So if you use spell check, that's a human in the loop AI technology. If you use fraud alerts, right? When you like buy a $7 smoothie from a weird store and then Apple is like, are you sure you want to buy this smoothie? Yes, I am. It's a Tuesday night. This is a random example. And of course, autocomplete is another one of these types of human in the loop technologies. If we zoom forward 6 slides, and this is the last thing I'll pitch before I open up to question, I like to think a lot about AI agent in the loop, right? We talk a lot about human in the loop. And if we're really going to the point of full automation at some point, how can we have an agent who's looking at results and validating results versus just us as humans? And so this is one thing that we think about quite a bit at Test Party. How do we use technology to validate technology in order to create better and more effective models within a specific niche, right? This niche right now is accessibility, but you can imagine using that same process in any type of niche: security, design, usability testing. And that's really the vision of where we think AI is going to go as it relates to kind of these human-focused design aspects, right? And so then the question then becomes, how good is your validation agent, right? And I could talk about this for hours, right? There's examples of positive validation agents where you're saying, yes, this looks right. And there's examples of negative validation agents where you're saying, no, this looks wrong, right? And if you have an agent who's really well trained on being a negative agent, they can actually give really great feedback in the same way that a positive agent can. And you put these two things together, and now you have a totally different system, which is more of a cyborg AI system than some sort of, human in the loop centaur system. So that was a lot of mumbo jumbo of what we're building. It's whatever. But let's open up to questions. Yeah.
It's not mumbo jumbo. It's your personal thoughts and reflections. And I love how the two of you had this theme of like mythology and literature, because it's the one thing that AI doesn't take into consideration. It's a lot of ancient wisdom that we've overlooked, and it's like history is doomed to repeat for those that don't learn it. So thank you for that reminder.
Yeah.
Getting into the meat of the question, as you ask these models like the automation, but what were the parameters that it used to make that conclusion? Because ultimately they're dependent on the knowledge graphs and the prompts. Chances are if I asked the same question, I probably would not give the same answers.
Yeah. Yeah, I was very generous. I said, assume you know everything. Meaning like you have full access to the code base, you can test these tools like Jason described Maestro, you had access to Maestro and you made it work in the ways that you assume it would work to be the most effective. I essentially assumed full access and full knowledge, which you can argue is kind of what a human would have, right? So that was the parameter on that question.
Hi. So when you talk about integrating AI into the evaluation loop, are you just considering like in English, or like is it also applicable to like other languages?
Yeah, I'll answer this question with a reflection. Like when ChatGPT first came out, it was trained on the global, like just all of Wikipedia, essentially, like the whole internet. And no one really trained it to speak different languages, but you could, chat in whatever language you wanted to ChatGPT, and it would respond back in that language. And so I assume, at least in this case, depending on the training data set that you give to your model, it'll still be able to do the agent evaluation in whatever language, right? Whether we're talking like English, Spanish, French, or we're talking React, JavaScript, TypeScript, or the language of pixels, or the language of pictures, or the language of video captions, right? You can start to redefine what a language is with a lot of these models. That's what a lot of the innovation is coming from today.
Have you noticed if different models perform better with different success criterion from the WCAG, and also what levels, like A, AA, AAA?
We
Or
talked about,
perform worse?
yeah, we talked about this at our all hands today, actually.
Okay.
I think if you go forward like 4 or 5 slides, it's in here somewhere. No, it's not. Never mind. I used to have a slide in this deck that was describing like how good an image alt text was. And you could ask, 10 different models to give you an alt text for a picture, and they would all be different. And then you can weigh it based off of like how good was the output. And there were better models at certain alt text than others, is essentially like the long story short. And so I'm sure that would also apply to these WCAG rules, that there are certain models that may be better at some rules than others. And even on one of the first graphics I showed of performance on like the SAT and the LSAT and the GRE, certain models performed better. So definitely, because no one really knows what's in the training data and no one really knows the model weights perfectly, there's some level of unpredictability. What that seems to imply is that you could, in theory, fine-tune these things to be really good at certain WCAG criteria, which may or may not be what we're doing.
Thank you.
All right. I saw another one over here. Hey, Sean.
Hey, I missed you guys. So hi. I'm going to say that I'm not the technologist in the room, which is funny because I'm chair of the New York Tech Alliance, but don't let that fool you. So I'm going to ask the most obvious question that I think most, lay people wonder is, what does this mean for what do you feel your findings mean for jobs and integration in terms of like the human element? So this is the Captain Obvious question, but
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is that like expertise matters more now than ever, right? Because like let's suppose you really want to go the route of agent in the loop for evaluation for everything, right? Meaning that you have an AI agent that reads your website code and suggests fixes, and you have another agent that tells you if those fixes are right or not. Like this is really, when you see people talking about MCP servers, that's kind of the route that's going down. Like that can only be, someone has to make the agent, right? Who's going to do that? The expert in saying this is right, this is wrong, even if you're just training your apprentice AI agent to do the work for you, right? And so I think what that tells me is that we're all in the right place at the right time by being experts at something or desiring to be an expert at something, and that expertise is never going to really go away. I guess the things, all the slides I skipped were like the why does that matter slides. So you asked a good question because I skipped all those slides. But really the key takeaway is there's a certain level of humanness to accessibility that a lot of other industries don't have. And so we need to retain that sense of human ability, that the work you do matters, because compliance is just before, right? There's so much more that we can do that we may not be able to train AI on.
well, because I have friends who do this by hand, and so I'm wondering, does this make them obsolete? Are they needed to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing? It would just be great to know, kind of. Obviously, you mentioned that we do need the experts, but do you think that it could make those jobs obsolete?
I think it'll probably change the jobs for sure. Like I think this that we're describing will be fundamentally different, right? And I wish I could predict what that looks like, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll kind of key off of that. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to take a couple online, then maybe one more in room, and then we can those staying around we can continue the conversation afterwards as well. But one question online was kind of healthy level of skepticism. LLMs have trouble with hallucinations. Can we really trust them to do accessibility remediation? Kind of keying off of that, where does the expertise lie? Question.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think certainly LLMs hallucinate. And I think the solution to that is you can call it like an anti-agent, right? What I'm talking about, where like you have an agent whose whole job it is to root out hallucinations, right? So you say, hey, assume that you're an expert in the WCAG. You are looking for commonly hallucinated errors for WCAG. Look at the results of this other agent and tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how accurate or not accurate it is, right? And so when you start to stack 100 of those types of agents on each other to look at the same code base, maybe specified to certain WCAG criteria, you start to get a different level of accuracy versus you just ask one agent and take the one result that's true.
And I think that's a really important, the adversarial agent like that. And the next question that said, I find myself skeptical of percentages the LLMs provided because we put some HTML and PDF through Copilot. It remediated 70% of the errors we introduced, but many of the remediations were wrong. So that's where the adversarial model would claims victory.
Yeah,
and need something else to refute it.
I trust AI to like write my emails, and that's that's about it for
Mhm.
now. Well, and also the rewrite all my code, but that's fine.
Do you include people with disabilities for testing your product?
We do, yeah, we do. We usually just hire, a specialist agency, and that's where I think to the question earlier, I think there's always going to be need to be specialists, right? Like at least at some level of the test process. Like I think accessibility is probably 10 years behind security, and even in security, like a pen test, like a physical person coming and testing your system is still done, right? And so I don't think there's any way to get around that. And I think if anything, it makes even more important lived experience versus just trained experience, because there's probably certain intangibles that you can't learn from training that you just experience from living.
I'll do one more online, one more in room, and then we'll need to wrap it up so we can send our captioner and interpreter home for the day. So for the HBR study, was there any ChatGPT-4 training or knowledge expectations as far as you know?
That study, no. But there was another one that was published, I think 5 months ago, that did a similar thing with Procter and Gamble, where they did provide training. Yeah.
One more in room. Yep.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was just wondering if you've had any thoughts on what we would need to change about education so that kids that are growing up with AI are going to become cyborgs and not, where they're actually mutually co-evolving and amplifying each other's capacities versus atrophying potentially.
So one thing I do on a weekly basis is I teach high school kids how to make startups, and it's over the course of a 12-week program. And usually, like this first 6 weeks are like your startup idea, and the last 6 weeks are like vibe coding. So like learning how to use like Claude by Anthropic and how to use Codium or how to use Lovable to like make applications. One thing that's really fun about that is I just buy like the most premium like version of these tools for them to use, and they all share a login. And so I bring this up because sometimes I'll go back and be like, I wonder what they're prompting, right? Like at this point, the output is not really the homework. Like the homework is like, how do they do it? And I use that when I go back to teach. And so I think it's really interesting to see how high school students today are using these tools because they're using it like in a cyborg way naturally, right? Like they're not just asking it a question and taking it at face value. It's funny because obviously I just give them access to this tool, which they use for the internship. And then some kids also use it for like all of their homework, which I'm like, should I feel guilty that I've just like completely hacked this child's like learning development and just like they're no longer gonna like write an essay? Yeah, or the homework needs to change. But it was funny because I was looking, this was even just like 2 days ago, I was like, what is this like chat about an essay about Odysseus? And it was one of my former students from like 6 months ago. So I was like, yo, like stop using this. Anyways, from 6 months ago, and she was asking a question. She was like, hey, like this is my essay. What do you think I need to improve about it? And I gave her all this feedback. And then she's like, okay, I like these 3 points in the introduction, change it in this way. And she was co-writing with it. And she said, hey, you lost my voice and my style. Take the style of paragraph 2 and 3 and match it to the introduction. Is that cheating? Is it learning, right? Like, or is it just the way that you have to use tools nowadays? And I was actually quite impressed. I was like, man, I'm such a good teacher. She's going to get away with this. They're never going to know. But that's kind of what I see happening. And so I think naturally the way that you use these tools, at least in day-to-day life, is probably the way that you might want to use these tools in our like very specific kind of accessibility work.